Linton, please.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? So I want to talk about how you get opportunities out of some of these problems. We'll talk a little bit about the fourth industrial revolution, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And then introduce this concept of collaborative community resilience, working with sharing, peering economy approaches. There's a project called Star Tides that gathers data on commercial technologies for resilience, and then talk about some of the opportunities and research needs. So Davos has identified, Dr. Schwab has identified 4 revolutions. The first, roughly 1780s, was the application of steam and water power to mechanical production. Second, around 1870, is the addition of electricity to mass production and divisions of labor. The third, in the late 1970s, 60s, is semiconductors, personal computers, and the beginning of robotics. But the fourth industrial revolution, just beginning, and this touches on things we've talked about here today, is the fusion of technologies, particularly bio, info, robo, nano, that blurs the lines between the physical and the digital and the biological spheres. The key distinctions between these, particularly between the third and the fourth, is the velocity of change and the scope and their systems-wide impact. This is going to be massively disruptive, and it's going to be accelerating. It doesn't just transform production and distribution. We've got to manage this in ways that are fundamentally different than we've done before. Collectively, it can provide very important benefits to society, but also it's going to, as has been mentioned again earlier today, negatively affect many individuals. Loss of jobs, pace of social change, threats from machine learning, artificial intelligence. But the responses cannot just be technological alone. They've got to address public-private, whole of society, transnational means, and comprehensive and integrated ways. So if you think about the velocity of tech change, if some parameter, say computing power per unit cost, is doubling about every 18 months. In a year and a half, you have 100% more capability. But in 5 years, it's 900%. In 10 years, it's 10,000%. In 15 years, it's 100,000% change. Now, this curve may level off. It may decrease. There may be some step functions and things like quantum computing. But the point is, linear projections cannot work from where we are today. And if you then look at the rate of change in biotech is even faster than information. The cost of sequencing the genome is down 6 orders of magnitude in a decade. Robotics are becoming ubiquitous. Information, as we've talked about, nano is on the verge of various breakouts. Energy we all depend on. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing. So you have to think about the interactions. I like to talk in terms of brine, bio, robotics, information, nano, and energy. How do all those fit together? There was an interesting piece about a month ago on Singularity Hub. This is Ray Kurzweil's blog. He talks about 7 technologies worth trillions. So I don't know whether the number is trillions or large billions, but it's big enough to at least pay attention. So he talks about deep learning. There's a quote from Bill Gates that basically says that sort of artificial intelligence can be worth 10 Microsofts, which is, and then they extrapolate that to the deep learning algorithm, and they come up with a figure of about $17 trillion over the next, say, 20 years in technology, healthcare, finance, transportation, and so on and so forth. Mobility services, projection, $10 trillion by 2030, of which about 20% will come back to the manufacturers of the vehicles. 3D printing of finished products at scale. One of the big hits against 3D printing is it only produces small production runs. I don't know if you've seen it, I think it's Adidas is now. Actually, you run a treadmill, it looks at your foot and how it interacts. They then 3D print a partial sole for you and your shoe. So it's becoming finished products at scale. CRISPR. CRISPR is this very precise means of sequencing the human genome, actually making changes to the genome. The point is this is enormously important, but even really on the venture capitalist radar in many cases yet. Mobile transactions, the projection is 15-time increase in just 5 years, or 3 years now. $15 trillion with Asia very much being in the lead. We heard this morning about the mobile tech in China, mobile finance in China. Robotics and automation. This is interesting because they're talking about a $12 trillion increase in US GDP by 2035. And this is not the massive replacement of jobs. This is people working with machines to increase the size of the overall pie. And finally, blockchain has been alluded to this morning. Crypto assets. 60% of the respondents in a recent survey expected this to reach $1 trillion in 10 years. But of those who responded, something like 35% expected to be $10 trillion. Again, I don't know within the order of magnitude what these numbers are. The point is these are technologies we need to be paying attention to as we go forward. So in terms of security-related issues out of the fourth industrial revolution and jobs, I mean, it can clearly raise global incomes, improve the quality of life, but they're going to be unequal labor markets, loss of jobs, low skill, low pay. On the other hand, there'll be high skill, high pay as well. What does this mean for social inequalities and social tensions? Service jobs appear to be particularly vulnerable. There's an Oxford study from a couple of years ago that talks about 47% of all American jobs being at risk of being replaced by automation. There's a much more nuanced McKinsey study here earlier this year that talks about 60% of all occupations could have 30% of their constituent activities automated with today's technology. Again, it brings you to a man-machine, human-machine teaming problem rather than just the replacement of jobs. So in some countries, it's going to be fine. Japan, South Korea, Germany, we have aging populations. The automation can be enormously valuable. What does it mean for the youth bulge areas of sub-Saharan Africa, the Islamic world, South Asia, if there are no entry-level jobs, and hence no stake in the international system? So we've seen that 1 million refugees overwhelms the European political system in 2015. I saw a number the other day that suggested there could be as many as 6 million people in North Africa right now who are looking for opportunities to emigrate. How does the political system handle that? Economist had a great quote about a year ago. It talks about high potential for domestic unrest, scapegoat finding, radical nationalization, protectionism, quote, unless governments and the private sector are really skillful in managing these changes. And there's not much in the historical record to suggest they're going to be that. So the question, though, then is, this works beyond government efforts, okay? There could be exceptional prosperity. You've got Diamandis that talks about abundance, but there also could be threats to the very security structures we're used to working with. And in fact, you can look at the kind of threat of false information, weaponization of information, these sort of drip, drip, drip challenges as actually underpinning the resilience of the population in the engaged nation, which in the future conflict may be more important than tanks, troops, artillery, or command posts. So how can you shape a more optimistic future? So one of the things we looked at is how could you look at building community resilience against diverse threats of both natural and man-made and economic, using collaborative, peer economy, sharing economy approaches that leverage emerging technologies. Focus on the community because the nation state often is too small. Nation state's too big, family's too small. And the community typically has common standards of dignity, justice, and fairness on which you could build. So the concept here at the moment is collaborative community resilience. And the idea is you promote capable communities that are productive, resilient to emerging challenges, sustainable with local resources. And the goal initially was to reduce pressures for migration, radicalization, and marginalization with the express goal of trying to address some of the European problems. How do you shift from threat to opportunity? And how do you make it possible for those who'd like to stay in their community to actually stay there? These often are proud people. They're very much like the societies from which they come. How do you make it possible for them to stay there? So there's a lady named Robin Chase, and Robin is the co-founder of Zipcar, so she has some street cred in this space. And she's written a book called Peers, Inc. And in this, the Inc. are the industrial strength platforms, like the internet and Google search engines, that take billions of dollars and years to build. The peers are what individuals, the bottom-up approach, can do with those infrastructures, with those platforms, to either innovate or develop excess capacity. For example, Airbnb gets to 650,000 beds in 4 years. It took Hilton 92 years to get to 610,000 beds with more traditional business models. Uber and Airbnb both use two platforms. Uber uses internet and cars. Airbnb uses internet and rooms. But in fact, there are all sorts of platforms out there today you can leverage. The explosion of innovation in high-tech urban agriculture. Today in Tokyo, they're growing 10,000 head of lettuce a day in a football stadium, using a fraction of the input of water and nutrients that would be in a typical farmer's field. The cost of solar panels is dropping faster than Moore's law. When you get to cheap energy, you also get cheap, clean water, with all that means in the developing world. ICT, information and communications technology, I don't know what's going to win, whether it'll be Google's Loons, the balloons, whether it'll be Richard Branson's smallsats, whether it'll be Zuckerberg's drones. There's going to be 4G internet globally in 5 to 7 years, right? Through Skyfly, through terrestrial infrastructures, whatever. How do we plan for that now? What does it mean for innovative learning, as we heard this morning? How many have worked with chatbots and conversational user interfaces? Some of you. Okay, so chatbot is basically, think of Siri on steroids. It becomes a real digital assistant you can work with. There's an 18-year-old in London who has written a chatbot to appeal parking tickets. So you talk to the machine, and when was your ticket issued, how much was it for, what was it, what's the serial number? It turns it into a bureaucratically acceptable form. So instead of you going before the judge and babbling about why you should appeal your parking ticket, you now have a system the bureaucracy understands. In 2 years, he has succeeded in appealing 160,000 parking tickets in London and New York. So he's now moved to Stanford, turned his attentions to homelessness. You talk to the machine, and the machine says, oh, stop, this is a problem for Child Protective Services. Let's fill out the appropriate forms. Stop, this is a problem for your defense attorney in your eviction case. Stop, this is a problem for homeless shelters. Get you in a shelter. The point is, this now means A, as the internet works out, you've got the illiterate populations that have access to things they never had before. It also means that people can address their bureaucracies in ways that are absolutely unimaginable. So StarTides is a project that works with this. And it really looks at leveraging the global talent of a network, promoting integrated approaches among multiple infrastructures, listening to what local societies want and need, and then recognizing that no lesson is ever learned until behavior changes. We observe a lesson, next typhoon comes through, you re-observe the same lesson, you keep re-observing the lesson until you educate, train, exercise, and incentivize to cause people to do things differently. So the real points of StarTides in this collaborative community resilience are how do you leverage the network, which now has universities in Asia, NGOs in Europe and Africa, Red Cross, US military, so it's public, private, whole of government, transnational. And then how do you integrate the diverse technologies? And the technologies who are kind of settled on this are those who are aligned with and drawn from things like Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Risk Reduction Framework and the Sphere Standards, so it's not just made up, it tries to match things that's going on in the international community. I love this quote from Raymond Wilson, how do you make hope possible rather than despair convincing? And again, governance and institution building are key. You've got to focus on what the concepts of dignity, justice, and fairness are in these villages. The Maasai may still want to hunt lions. People may want to do this under Sharia law. Doesn't matter. You're focusing on keeping people in the communities. We're talking about a broad definition of security, freedom from want, freedom from fear, not just cross-border attack. So these are the way it fits together. There's a political, there's a social, there's an economic component. The political is governance, the social is resilience, the economic, of course, is the development piece, and then here are the technological platforms. But So it's got to be, again, those four together. But underpinning it are these cross-cutting elements. Narrative. You have to sit down and listen and understand what makes sense to the community. And then there's a large element of systems thinking in this as you tie together these different technologies. But once you get your J. Forrester systems diagram, spaghetti diagram, you have to turn that back into a narrative that makes sense to the village. So the narrative has to be part of this all across it. Shared knowledge of the lessons learned, logistics, right thing, right place, right time, and lots of really interesting digital enabling technology, geospatial information systems, identity management. And one of the things that came up earlier today, blockchain. I think blockchain can have enormous value in things like land titles in the third world, increasing transparency of transactions, reducing corruption. So a little more detailed look under the political governance piece. Institution building is absolutely critical. Under the resilience. Resilience, lots of times felt just absorb a shock and go back to where you were. It's really not. You have to be prepared. You have to have mitigation measures in place ahead of time. And the idea, the anti-fragile, that was mentioned this morning with Nassim Taleb, is how do you wound up better off after the shock comes through? So my soundbite on this is be prepared to bounce forward better rather than just bounce back. Education was talked about. What kind of education do you take advantage of with the distance learning, innovative learning, to train the young people, teach the young people what they're going to need to know? Collaborative economic, we've talked about. If you look at the risk reduction framework, the development goals and so on and so forth, the youth, gender, democracy, and all that are part of it. I treat that as being part of the community in which we're dealing. And of course, climate change affects all of this. So where we are is this collaborative community resilience, and Star Tides are both moving to the George Mason University, which is near Washington, D.C. It's being focused on teaching and research and outreach. We've had a series of workshops since October of 2016. And interestingly enough, the first workshop was looking at Mideast, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And someone from Appalachia, a very poor coal mining region in the United States, came and said, you know, this is great, but there are underserved regions of the developed world that need this just as much as what you're talking about in the developing world. So we've been focusing a lot actually on Appalachia since then. This February, 7th February this year, Tom Friedman, the columnist, was our keynote speaker. He's been a great supporter. And we've been looking at sites in various places. What we find is the absolute key here is local leadership. There is no way this is going to work if somebody who looks like me walks into a village and said, this is what you should do. It's got to be, you know, a local pull from the local leadership. And one of the things we've found is that in many, many cases, particularly in the US, I'm sure it's in other villages too, the local population is so jaundiced by all the people who have come by over the years and promised them neat stuff that somebody from wherever, Washington or Brussels, wherever, has almost no credibility. What we find is a lot of credibility are students, young people, especially those from the region who's gotten some education, have some of the innovative ideas we heard about this morning, can go back and have a much better coupling function than any of us elected to have. We'll have the 11th annual technology demonstration for the Star Tides Technologies near Washington, the 12th to the 14th of September, and then the following week in the Pentagon. If anyone is in the area and interested, it's free to attend. Please come by. George Mason has been just terrific in offering, supporting this. There's actually paperwork working its way through the system now to set up a center of excellence in community resilience. And we'd love for opportunities to partner with other organizations. The core ideas here are diverse. So diversity, development, diplomacy, defense, resilience. It's got to tap into a wide range of talent. We heard this morning about how you've got to have diversity in the opinions. There are at least 10 different academic parts of the university that could be interested. The School of Engineering in several pieces, from energy to civil to cyber to whatever. There's a School of Science. Actually, Mason has a School of Geospatial Information Systems. There's a School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, so on and so forth. It's got to be multidisciplinary for not only research projects, but also teaching and perhaps funding. Where we'd like to go with this, eventually, this is 3 to 5 years out, is to look in terms of integrated approaches to resilience and risk management. It turns out that a lot of these approaches share things with different disciplines. Cybersecurity, you can actually think of as resilience of systems and networks. Military mission assurance is resilience when you're under attack. Cascading casualties across infrastructures, increasing the physical resilience of the underpinnings of society. Public health would be increasing the resilience of populations, and so on and so forth. The problem is, as you look across civil and military government, private sector, academia, IOs, NGOs, they all have very similar concepts, but they use completely different terminology. I was talking with a business leader who said, I've been in business for 30 years, I've never used the word resilience. What do you use? Well, we have continuity of operations, we've got corporate succession planning, we've got supply chain risk management. And so the question is, could you, by melding these different disciplines together, find a way to articulate in terms of risk management and return on investment a private sector case for why these public resilience infrastructure projects are worthwhile? There's not nearly enough money in the public treasuries to fund all the US infrastructure projects or 2% of GDP for defense and NATO or whatever. There's lots of money in the private equity accounts. So we can find ways to bridge the gap in the terminology. Hopefully we can find a way to do a better job of linking the public and the private sectors in this. A lot of opportunities for research laid out here. How do you do decision making? I mean, does in fact peering sharing economy really work in the long run? It worked for Airbnb, it worked for Uber, at least till they had their recent problems, but over time it's just become another oligopoly that takes advantage of piecework labor. How do you bridge the decision making across these various cultures, and what's common in Ghana or common, how much would be useful in Appalachia or in Southeast Asia or whatever. But the focus has got to be here at the interface of policy and technology and sociology and economy. And we don't do that very well. We're all sitting on a little stovepipe. So how could you put together a truly multidisciplinary center that would address this, looking at security and sustainability and public-private and transnational goals? What are some pilot projects, and particularly then who would lead them? So let me just close, following up with May Ann's point. So this is a question whenever I get my claws into an engineering graduate student or anyone basically in college. So what technology do you think your children will use to confuse you to the same extent that you confuse your parents? Now we're talking here about somebody presumably doesn't have kids yet. We're looking for when they become teenagers, so 12, 15 years out, what's it like? So the first tends to be the cyborgization of the human body. So instead of irritating your parents with, hey, mom and dad, look at the tattoo I got, it's look at the chip I had implanted. The second is transgenerational perception differences. Well, grandma, don't you see that? Well, no, she doesn't, because you're wearing the glasses with the augmented reality, and you're actually seeing a physically different world than the previous generation is. Genome modification. We mentioned CRISPR, other techniques out there. Well, mom and dad, I tried out for the track team. I wasn't fast enough, so I had my genome modified. The problem I have with this is that there may be legal, moral, ethical reasons for not doing this, but all these technologies are here today. And if you're talking about a kid who's not yet born, where they're going to be in 12 to 15 years, this is shooting way behind the rabbit. So where's it going to be? So the last one was brought up was networked minds. And so what's that about? Well, there was an experiment that was funded at UCLA 2 years ago. Person A sits down next to person B. Person A thinks about raising their arm. Person B raises their arm. Very basic research. This was even before Elon Musk and his little, whatever they call it, the electrodes in the brain. But I just ask you to think about what are some other things out there and how might we adopt our world, adopt our thinking about the world to this in ways that can promote optimism and the kind of resilience of the community rather than fragmenting some of the other things that happen. Thank you very much. Nice.